Hello, and thank you very much for being with us. My name is Andrej Mircev. I'm a postdoctoral fellow for the project Performance, Conservation, Materiality, and Knowledge here at the Bern Academy of Arts. And today I'm very happy that I have the possibility to speak with my dear friend and colleague, Bonnie Marranca. Bonnie Marranca is a publisher and editor of the OB award-winning PAJ Publications, a journal of performance and art, which she co-founded in 1976 and which has had a big influence on the emerging field of performance studies. She has written 4 collections of criticism, and I will just mention a few of them. Timelines, Writings and Conversations, Performance Histories, Ecologies of Theater, and among the many anthologies she has edited are New Europe, Place from the Continent, Place for the End of the Century, a book that was very important for me, Theater of Images, and her new book, Alchemies of Theater, Plays, Scores, and Writings, book dedicated to Dick Higgins. She is a Guggenheim Fellow and Fulbright Senior Scholar and has been teaching at various universities such as Columbia, Princeton, NYU, University of California, San Diego, Frye University in Berlin, University of Rio de Janeiro, to mention a few, and she is Professor Emerita of Theater at the New School Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts. I'm very happy that I can say hello to Bonnie Marranca, and here are my 2 questions for you, dear Bonnie.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this project.
So the first question is, can performance be conserved? If yes, how? And if no, why not? And my second question is, what does it mean to conserve performance?
I think first, I was thinking about the term conserve, because we've always connected, the conservation of works in a way with art and painting. So what does conserve mean in our situation with performance? I mean, conserve has many other definitions, like to manage, to preserve. I like preserve, maybe in a way rather than to conserve. It means to care for something, to safeguard it, to sustain it. So along that context, I think of performance within, say, the ecology of a community. It's a project within the college, within this kind of ecological context. Of course, we can preserve performance in photos, photo documentation, in videos, historical documentation. Very good theater historians, through working in archives and history books and letters and original texts and so on, can bring a lot of the historical performances to life, especially when there are a lot of letters and writings by the artists. For example, some months ago, I read a biography of Eleanor Aduza, and it came so much to life because she wrote so many letters and described so much of her performance. In fact, I'm sorry to miss the big exhibit that's going on in Venice of Eleanor Aduza. But one time when I was there a few years ago, I was in a library and collection in Venice, and I was shown her costumes and her dresses. So, there are many different kinds of artifacts. It depends what archival things are left for us. So there's the work of historians, there's the work of artists in preserving their legacies. But there are also publications. That's part of the project. And I began to think of that also because I just wrote a few weeks ago the editorial for the final issue of PAJ, which will end publication this fall after 48 years. And I
Hmm.
referred to it finally, again, within this ecological context of a community, and I referred to it as a conservation project.
Hmm.
So, this sense of care and publishing, all of this works together, and also teaching. Teaching is a way to conserve or to preserve or to maintain um, performance.
Hmm.
But then the question is, what performance are we talking about? Because we think of things in different ways from theater or performance art. And that's another area to move into. What are we talking about? Theater studies or performance art from the art world? Because my big theme for the recent decades has been that there are two different histories of performance, one in theater and one in visual arts. And part of my writing and thinking, publishing, teaching, and editing over the last few decades has been to try to bring these two histories together for a larger idea of the history of performance ideas. That's what I'm concerned with, the history of performance ideas. And the Dick Higgins book, which just came out from University of Michigan, he's an exemplary figure who has always been considered within visual arts and ignored by theater. And it turns out he has hundreds of plays. And he was done off Broadway in major places like the Judson Poets Theater. And he also did the first electronic opera. He's left out of the media histories. So that's a clear example of an artist who is so prolific in so many areas: drawing, poetry, theater, performance, publishing, filmmaking, drawing, everything. And he's squeezed into visual arts because of the way we construct the histories of these fields. But he's an exemplary figure in exactly this separation and the necessity of merging more the history of the larger history of performance and theater into performance ideas.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. This already sparked so many interesting ideas. Let me get back to this two different histories of performance. Where do you see their overlapping, and what do you think uh, should we still do? And is it possible that uh, because conservation is also a discipline that comes more from the side of visual arts, or is
Mhm.
part of the history of art. So in that sense, what do you think? Can we take something, or is it possible to apply it to theater studies?
In
Would
terms
that
of,
help to maybe close this gap between these two different histories?
well, you mean in like specific artifacts, because
Yes.
performance itself is so ephemeral. Theater, it's easy to conserve or preserve in a way because we have a theatrical repertoire. That's the basis of theatrical production. Um, so we have a repertoire, we have a large body of literature extending back to the Greeks in terms of poetics and theory, going back to Aristotle. Performance art is very strange, and I'm not, notice I'm not just saying performance because there's a confusion. I'm referring to what's in the art world by the earlier term performance art, um, because it comes out of the art world. It didn't involve actors.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
so so how do we deal with the history of performance art? Because it's very strange with performance art compared to theater, if we're going to try to bring them together. Performance art, in a way, is the only live art that is not virtuosic, unlike all the other arts, music, or all the other live arts, music, dance, um, acting, and so on. Um, so I've always thought of performance art as really that we don't think of it in terms of a repertoire, but we also don't think of it in terms of standards, because people don't write about performance art or performance in the art world in the same way that they are critical with performances in the theater world regarding acting or production values. A lot of the writing about performance has been documentation, interviews with the artists. It never really developed a critical vocabulary in the way that theater has. So if performance art moves closer to theater, will theater critics review it? Will they develop a body of comparative studies and between different performances? Will they develop more value-oriented criticism, or will performance art just remain, where it is in this kind of documentation or theoretical context, but not have a body of criticism that other art forms have to it? So the material aspect of performance could be props and set design. It could be costumes. It could be the play or performance. But on the other hand, you can also think about reperformance, which is a whole other topic and something that I'm not so crazy about, the idea of reperformance. I don't think everything should be reperformed. Some things lend themselves more than others. For example, since we're talking about Dick Higgins, obviously the Fluxus pieces and all pieces based on instruction are much more neutral and they can be reperformed. But say to reperform something by Carolee Schneemann, or Joan Jonas, because of their particular style and existential infusion of themselves in the work, I'm not interested in seeing those reperformances.
You mentioned something very, very interesting and important: instructions, scores, notations. Did your research on Dick Higgins, what did you come up with in terms of could that also be a hypothesis that maybe that is also a way of conserving performance through scores, through notations?
Yes, and that's my book is of his work is subtitled Plays, Scores, Writings, because he wrote essays about theater. He wrote, for example, he wrote about an essay, which is the last in the book, called Signature Performances. And he wrote it a few years before his death. And it's precisely about watching the original performer or the original art, the originator of a work performing, or the other fact is that to keep works alive, other people have to perform them. But sometimes people want to see the original artist. So he addressed this just a few years before his death in 1998 about this the legacy of performance. In fact, PAJ published that in the mid 90s. So a number of his things are out and out. He thought of plays. By the time he was in his 20s, he had written a number of texts in a volume that he was circulating in just typed form, mimeographed form, called 100 Plays. He'd written like 100 plays, but a lot of them are instructions and some are drawings. And this is what I became attracted to. He has this genre of his work called graphis, not graphic, but graphis. And some of these are scores, and they were performed by dancers and poets and downtown performers all over Europe and here. And in some case, the drawing was put on the floor almost as a map. And the drawing has sometimes words around it. And the performers have to kind of interpret in a way this drawing. So he showed the way to many kinds of ways of conceiving scores, but also plays. And I became very intrigued by performance drawing, which is another way of conservation. Obviously, Robert Wilson is the outstanding figure in that field because he draws the work and we have all his drawings before it's staged. All of the work is drawn and it's rehearsed in silence and then it's staged, but it's based on drawings. So we have all those drawings. Joan Jonas is a person who draws during a performance. But I found that this is a neglected field, performance drawing, which is a very important field for conservation because it's physical artifacts that we have. And many people who perform, they have drawings that are part of their way of conceiving a production. Sometimes they draw in the production, but many times before it.
I think it's interesting because it also then brings us again to this perspective where we are actually asked to sidestep or to in a way be very critical about this distinction between theater on one side and the visual arts on the other side, which I think the idea of the performance drawing actually brings this very nice into a, it creates this sort of intermediality, which is I think also very important, interesting. And just I was thinking when as soon as you mentioned it, of course, Higgins' book on intermedia, where he also advocates for this sort of blurring of the borders between different art forms.
Yes, in his manifesto Intermedia from the 60s, which is really a new ecology of the arts, the way that he conceived of this. But yet the way that we study the places that performances take place, it's all the way they're funded, it's all been separated in visual arts. For example, you don't have theater people coming to Documenta, or to art fairs. Theaters performances are done mostly in theaters where they don't show performance art. So we still have this separation for decades and decades. And, the big issue is, of course, representation. When the whole field of performance studies developed, it was very much against the dramatic literature and the representation of a play. And of course, the defining factors of performance in the art world is that it takes place in real space in real time. But I've always been critical of the way that audiences have been thought of. For example, for decades, people have said, oh, a theater audience is passive, and which is crazy and stupid because thinking is not passive. You're thinking, you're sitting in the audience thinking. Hannah Arendt wrote a whole book on thinking and the public sphere. But it doesn't mean that if you're an audience member in a performance art piece that you're active. So these ideas have been carried for generations now. So they're definitely defining factors between the way the art world and the theater world thinks of things. So our question is, who's going to preserve performance art? Who's going to preserve theater? What is their training going to be? And why are we concerned with this ephemeral art? On the one hand, we want to just know about it. We want to teach it. And then in some cases, people want to experience these performances through re-performance.
Let me just get back to this one aspect which you mentioned, the teaching, which I also find very important as a way of conserving performance. When you look back at your teaching experiences, do you think you were able to also create or how were you reflecting on the historical dimension of theater?
I first started teaching really in the mid 80s, and I went for a few semesters as a visiting professor at University of California, San Diego, and I always taught contemporary work. At that time, I was teaching people whose work, playwrights more connected with experimental theater and the avant-garde who were not known. like, say, Maria Irene Fornes, who was not so well known then, or maybe and then other courses I would perhaps teach, Richard Foreman or people like that, or Mac Wellman. And I early on, I also taught other topics like the spiritual dimension of modernism, in which I would have the historical avant-garde, and then I might have Meredith Monk in it. So, or someone like Wilson, so that I brought it from performance history of a historical nature up to the contemporary. But I really started working in a very visual way and combining these fields, believe it or not, when I started teaching in Germany. Professor Erika Fischer-Licht invited me to teach American avant-garde when she was at Mainz. And at that time, a lot of students in the PhD program did not know English really well. So we had a series of writings, but what I did for the first time was developed, at that time, it was slides, visual slides, so I could show the work. And I developed a system of putting all my notes on index cards and then speaking about the slides that were shown of avant-garde work. And by that time in the early 90s, I had known a number of the artists. I had seen a lot of these great works. And so I could talk about them in this anecdotal way and from a performance history point of view. And that's how I developed this interdisciplinary approach in my teaching, going back to the early 90s. And I carried it throughout wherever I went. That so much of the teaching was trying to bring dance and even painting and architecture and theater and visual art and performance wherever I could, because I enjoyed teaching, Dada, Futurism, Symbolism, Surrealism, Russian staging, Bauhaus. And then I would bring it up to, say, Robert Wilson and Fluxus and Happenings, so that I tied all of this in together. And that's how it worked in teaching. I tried to bring visual arts and theater together in my teaching and constructing of a curriculum.
That brings me maybe to our last question, or to my last question. What does it mean to conserve performance?
Well, I guess my main project of conserving performance was through being a publisher and editor, because that is another way to conserve performance, but by being a writer, educator, and publisher. So I wasn't involved in doing performances or organize or producing performances, but when you think about it, publishing is another way. As I said, I refer to it as a conservation project, because within a journal or within a book, there may be the only photographs existing that document a performance. There may be the only descriptions that document kind of performances. So we have to put all these things together. It's not one thing. It's not just redoing the performance or just looking at the photograph. It's very important that that we're using the memory of people who actually saw things and can write well about them. And that's often our only kind of documentation, our only form of knowledge about performance. So criticism and writing about art is very important, which is why I'm very critical of the whole turn these recent decades just toward theory. Often people have never seen the work they're writing about. They don't express any feeling of liking it or disliking it or having any kind of judgment or values about it. When you think about reconstructing history, much of it is based on what critics and historians have said, certainly in terms of capturing the period and the context of a work. So I think that we can't really neglect the value of really, rigorous and knowledgeable criticism which is writing about art, not about theories about art, and then the work of the historian, and then publication, artifacts. So all these things create this kind of ecology around conserving and legacy. Legacy is a big theme, obviously, today. I think we'll gain more and more performance knowledge also because more archives are going to universities and other centers. In fact, PAJ's archive opens in 2025. The Yale Beinecke Library has bought the PAJ archive and my personal papers. So I imagine, since at Yale, the Yale School of Drama will, turn to that, and young students will see different views based on correspondence and texts and letters and files and all kinds of things like that. I was able to research Dick Higgins because his papers went to Northwestern. There had been a new book about Charlotte Moorman, and her papers are also at Northwestern. Carolee Schneemann's work is at Stanford. So what I mean is that the archive, I would like to see people get back to the archive also, and there will be increasing archives as we turn more and more toward legacy and also the writing of performance history. And that's a big issue now, archives and legacy and new interpretations, getting new material, new biographies. Yeah, I hope that theater studies, because I'm more of a theater studies person, not really a performance studies person. I hope theater studies turns back to history and archive and research, and kind of moves away from the reliance on theories. It's getting quite stale now, to have theater written about in this highly theoretical way around a few fashionable topics.
Yes, to get back to the viscerality of history, and also, yeah, materiality that is there in the archives, in the legacies that are also, in my opinion, sometimes overlooked. How rich that there is actually a rich unwritten history that we have to return to, or memory also.
I think it's happening somewhat in dance, and dance also because it's done by trained performers. There is the issue of reperformance in dance, for example, redoing, say, some of Yvonne Rainer's work, or maybe the Judson work. But it's really a difference when you have this kind of performance done by trained people, or you're left with performance art by really untrained people, because there's no real training in performance art. It's kind of an illustration of someone else's work with reperformance in a way. And as I said, I feel it only works to some extent with instructional pieces. And, maybe not even all of them. It just depends on that. Yeah. But yeah, there are a lot of new directions to go in as more and more material becomes available and people rethink the historical figures.
Thank you so much. I think this was very, very inspiring, and it opened so many new possibilities to rethink not only performance and conservation, but also performance, theater, and visual arts. Thank you for this great conversation.
Thank you so much too for doing it. I'm happy to be part of this.